What's up, YouTube? Ryan Panny here. Hope you guys are doing reasonably well. It is time for a review of the new Suicide Silence record, Become the Hunter, out last Friday, Valentine's Day, February 14th. God, that last record from Suicide Silence, the self-titled record, that was so heartbreaking for me. Because let me tell you, nothing gives me more joy than being the one guy that likes the record that everyone else hates. That is always a thrill for me. Like, I loudly and proudly defend Megadeth's Risk record. I like that record a lot. And by contrast, I don't really enjoy shitting all over Saint Anger like everybody else does. It's not fun for me. I wanted to like that record so bad, but the truth is, the self-titled record, it was a perfect storm of poor decision making, even poorer execution of those decisions, and then when the inevitable negative feedback started rolling in, an inability to handle it well, so to speak. I admire risk taking. I love records that buck trends, and I suppose in theory the idea of a very prominent deathcore band making a record in 2017 with one of nu metal's key architects, Ross Robinson, that was bucking trends. And I was also especially hoping to like it because, full disclosure, I am not a Suicide Silence fan. The one record I truly enjoy by them is their final record with their late frontman Mitch Lucker, The Black Crown. When it came out, I thought that The Black Crown did a fantastic job of bottling up the primitive fury of deathcore, but with some intelligent songwriting as well. It's one of those records that I would feel completely comfortable showing to someone who had never heard deathcore before and feel like I was putting the genre's best foot forward. Carnifex Slow Death, that's another one that I think of that kind of falls into that category if you want to know where I'm coming from. So that's just something that I wanted to get out of the way first regarding my personal perspective going into this new one, Become the Hunter. I'm just so intrigued to see where the band goes after the self-titled record was A, such a drastic stylistic shift, and B, earned such a negative fan response. I'm curious to see how the band comes back. Are they gonna double down on that and just kind of give the finger to everybody, or are they gonna make the other mistake they can make, which is by playing it way too safe in response? They're kind of between a rock and a hard place now. Well, with this new one, I gotta completely flip the script on my review of the self-titled record. Because with the self-titled record, I remember very specifically being so frustrated with frontman Eddie Hermida, and how sometimes the band would lay an interesting or promising musical foundation, and then Hermida would just swoop in and take a big runny dump all over all of it. Like, his vocals on that album really helped turn a below average album into a fucking bad album. Well, with this one, I have to completely flip that, because Eddie Hermida is the fucking MVP of Become the Hunter. His vocal performances on all of these songs are absolutely magnetic. Not everything that's going on with all the other band members is always all that interesting, which we'll get to, but Eddie Hermida on this record is out of this world. He crushes every song. There is so much agony and so much torture behind his voice. He sounds like a man who's scraping the bottom of his psyche for every last ounce of pain he's ever felt in his life, and then just channeling it into his vocals. You kind of gotta wonder if he's unleashing some of these performances with the criticism that he faced from the last record in mind, from assholes like me. Some of my favorite vocal moments, Skin Tight, where the band make the exciting decision to have these piercing screams over these eerie and ominous clean guitars. I think that's a very interesting and creative dynamic. In Hiding, which is actually one of my least favorite songs, Eddie's screams at the beginning of that one are so fucking visceral. I think Two Steps, the single, really showcases his versatility as a vocalist. The title track is a wonderful display of Eddie's talents too, even though it is a duet with this vocalist from a band called Spite that I was previously unfamiliar with. But just both the brutal layered screams in that chorus, and then of course the just disgusting guttural low that ends the record. One last highlight that stuck out to me vocally are those final choruses in the song Love Me to Death, where the backing vocals sort of overlap and pile onto each other and just become this avalanche of yelling. Yeah, the vocals are the best part of Become the Hunter by far, and if and when I ever revisit this thing, it'll be probably to hear Eddie's performance again. And in terms of my concern that the band were gonna play it too safe on this record, there's a lot of that for sure, but the band do some exploring as well. I mentioned Skin Tight as very creative, the way Eddie's screaming over a quiet part. Obviously, the otherwise boring intro Meltdown does introduce a light element of theatricality. I love the acoustic guitars in Serene Obscene. I think the slowdown in The Scythe is pretty effective. So there are some ways where the band maneuver to keep the dry monotony of deathcore at bay. Of course, another way they keep the monotony of deathcore in check is by not playing it sometimes. That tends to help. Obviously, this is my bias showing here, but I find that my favorite moments on this record are the ones that lean away from the core and lean into the death metal side of things. Like, I love the title cut. It's probably my favorite here. That one maintains a tight riff-focused approach and doesn't get too sidetracked by excessive breakdowns. There's that first half of Disaster Valley, which injects sort of an at the gates melodic death metal feel. And then the Scythe has a lot of riffs and grooves that are very influenced by 90s Floridian death metal. So these end up being the highlights for me, surprise, surprise. But in the interest of giving the core its due as well, Serene Obscene is definitely my favorite in that department. The way that the entire band is in lockstep at parts, vocals, guitars, bass, drums, everybody moving in unison it's absolutely destructive on that one. I just cannot imagine that in a live setting. Dun, 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 dun. But something I don't enjoy, and unfortunately this is kind of baked into the cake with deathcore a little bit, is that a lot of times on this record, there's such an incongruence between the complexity of the drums versus the guitars. It's kind of unnerving. Like, drummer Alex Lopez absolutely brutalizes his drum kit on this record with explosive blast beats and frantic fills and creative field changes. And with the exception of the breakdowns, of course, where the guitars and drums are intentionally synced up, the rest of this record, it just feels like he's completely outperforming the guitarists. Metal is still largely a guitar-driven form of music, and when the drums are this disproportionately better and more interesting than what the guitars are doing, it kind of leaves this weird gap. Like, this is a high caliber drum performance, and when the drums are so intense and so electrifying, and then the guitars come waltzing along like da 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 da, it feels kind of mismatched. Again, it feels like there are musical gaps that are begging to be filled in. I keep thinking about that first solo section in the song Disaster Valley as like the best example of this. Or the lackluster lead single Two Steps has a lot of parts as well. Death's Anxiety has some overly dumbed down parts guitar-wise. The drums are way ahead of the guitars in terms of holding your interest. Which, I get it, that's kind of the point of this genre. You still have the extreme metal drums, but you have the guitars dialed back to something that's more primitive and more visceral. And I see the appeal, it just, for me, leaves something to be desired. And that's without getting into the lead guitars on this album, which, aside from that one neat little chromatic lead in the song Love Me to Death, they're pretty useless on this album. You've got like Kirk Hammett level, what's the point type leads in the song Disaster Valley. I think the two-step solo is pretty clunky. There are those boring arpeggios in Feel Alive, although to be fair, Randy Rhoads coming back from the dead couldn't have saved Feel Alive for me. I think the middle section of the Scythe could have been really cool with some more clever note choices in that solo. So yeah, both the lead guitars and the rhythm guitars just don't keep up with the caliber of drumming for me. And not only compositionally, but the way Suicide Silence approach music emotionally also leaves a bit to be desired. You know, I already mentioned a couple exceptions like Skin Tight, like the middle section of the Scythe, but other than that, you get the sense while you're listening to this record that you couldn't enjoy it all the way through without just a permanent puss on your face, just because the only emotion is anger. That's it, just raw, relentless anger. After a while, you just end up feeling a bit dulled because this record only has one temperature, you know? And again, it's not even like the guitars are expressing the full extent of what that could be, what that chaos could sound like. And it's not like the lyrical themes leave any emotional wiggle room either. It's all just serial killers and violence and it's basically the lyrical equivalent of what's going on musically in terms of emotional range. But look, coming from someone who personally, deathcore is one of my least favorite subgenres of metal, there is a lot of red meat for Suicide Silence's fan base on Become the Hunter. If their MO was to go back and do the status quo plus a little extra, they 100% accomplished that. They really did. This record's got a dry and ugly sound. It's just nasty and in your face. Again, Eddie Hermida turns in an awesome vocal performance. There's only so much I can say to knock it. For my taste, it's still an overly simplistic and one-dimensional form of extreme metal that I just can't get into, but I really did enjoy the process of trying to like it, and I think their fans are gonna be really satisfied with the result here. Become the Hunter gets a 5 out of 10 from me. As always, thank you so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video and are not yet subscribed to this channel, please consider doing so by clicking right over here, as well as checking out any other rock or metal-related content that I publish here on a weekly basis. I really appreciate you watching, liking, disliking, just engaging in any fashion. Twitter, Instagram handle @RyanPandyMusic. Again, thank you so much for watching, guys, and I will see you soon.